Go. So today's session, this one is on using Varnish and Drupal together. Got some introductions. We have Bill Bacher and Hugh Brown. They're senior system administrators here in ITS Enterprise Infrastructure. My name is Josh Kane. I'm a senior application developer here. I'm in communications and marketing. We've changed our name like 5 times and I'm still figuring it out. The 3 of us work together. Pardon?
You can't sell it to your upper level bosses?
No, they keep buying different ones. Okay. Do you work in marketing and communications? Do you know them? If so,
no, but I work for the university, so.
There we go. The 3 of us work together on a Drupal implementation here on campus, and what we're going to be doing today is pulling on that experience. Not so much a show and tell, but more talking about here's what worked, here's what didn't work, here are results, and here's where we ran into trouble. So that's going to be kind of the focus today. So we start with the Varnish overview. Huh. No, I'm okay. Thank you, Bill.
That's hard.
We start with the Varnish overview. We're going to talk a little bit about our Varnish implementation. Do a little bit about using Varnish and Drupal. What options do you have? How does it pull together? We're going to actually dig into the Varnish Control Layer. We're going to talk about the pressure testing we did with Varnish and Drupal. At the very end, we'll have some resources, and then we'll take questions. All right, so Varnish overview. It's a highly configurable open source front-end HTTP caching solution. If you understand that, you can leave. It's best used when you have high traffic for anonymous users. There are some ways you can use Varnish to optimize some caching for people who are logged in. Not really what it's designed for. It is a relatively mature software package, and it has pretty solid Drupal integration. I've heard of people using it with Drupal 4. Using it with 7 is a snap. Again, no thank you. So our work with Varnish, we needed a hosting solution for our campus emergency site. This site is intended to provide updates to the public in the case of an emergency on campus, varying scales. What's interesting about this challenge is that under normal campus operations, this site will get maybe 100 visits a week, and most of those will probably be search engines. In a crisis, it goes straight up through the roof. The bigger the crisis, the more traffic we'll get. Sort of unmeasurable numbers as far as we know right now. So the site was already built in Drupal for a variety of reasons. So Varnish was the logical solution. You said, what are you going to do for front-end caching? With Drupal, everybody says Varnish. We are actually now in production with the Varnish Drupal MySQL cluster. Is there anything you guys want to add? Oh, good. So Varnish plus Drupal. This was interesting to me. I figured when you installed Varnish, when you were going to do Varnish with Drupal, you'd start with a module. And it turns out that the simplest way, and the way I would recommend starting, is with Varnish and not really worry about any modules in Drupal. So you can actually add a Varnish server to your HTTP stream without adding any modules to Drupal. You want to play around with a few configuration settings in the performance section of your Drupal install. But actually Varnish sits in front. Drupal does not need to be necessarily aware that Varnish is in front of it. You can go to a more complex level, and the Drupal Varnish module, you can install that. What it does is it uses Varnish's admin control channel, and it gives you bidirectional communication. This binds Drupal's page caching infrastructure, all the cache bins and all that stuff. It binds it to Varnish, so that if you purge something from within Drupal, you purge a page cache, it can tell Varnish, hey, clear that out at the same time. There are some additional Drupal modules. They're varying quality. They offer enhancements and further extensions. We actually have only tested this. We went into production just with the simplest. That was not something that would have been part of my expectations or roadmap when we started. Anything you all want to add? Yes?
You say HTTP, does it not work for SSL as well?
I believe it does work for SSL, so HTTPS would be.
Okay.
Most of the time with HTTPS, though, at least in our experience, we're working on the admin level, and we'll get to that in a bit. So here's a simple Varnish diagram. You have your internet, you have your Varnish, and you have your Drupal. The yellow arrows, that's your HTTP anonymous, and that's really where you get your bang for your buck with Drupal, is when it caches. What happens is, request comes to Varnish, and Varnish has to go through its own logic and decide, should I return a cache page or not? In certain cases, you don't want Varnish to return a cache page. For example, if you have people logged into Drupal, we don't want them seeing cache content, we want them seeing it as fresh. If Varnish has it in cache, it just ships it back, lightning fast. If not, it asks Drupal for it. And then it passes it back and it caches it. So that's your main business with Varnish. This green arrow, that's for your authenticated users. And what you have to do is you have to instruct Varnish to pass them through. And we'll get to the specifics of how you do that in a bit. And then up here, this red line is again your Varnish admin layer, our channel. That gives you that bi-directional communication. Any questions about that? All right. Here's what it looks like actually implemented. This is our Varnish cluster. This diagram was done by Bill. You can see that multiple Varnish servers, multiple Drupal servers, multiple database servers, firewall, GTM. What I find interesting is that if you can get this in your head and understand and put these pieces together, this is actually still fairly straightforward in my opinion. I mean, I had two great system administrators to work with, which if you're going to do a Varnish implementation for Drupal, I'd recommend having your Drupal dev and your system administrator. If you are both a Drupal dev and a system administrator, you're probably making more money than the three of us. So. Exactly. So if you can get this working and you know what you're doing, you get these pieces working, clustering is really not that much of a step beyond, in my opinion, having worked with these guys. Any questions about this? Yes.
Absolutely.
No, working with these guys to create clusters is much easier than what I would have done on my own. So Varnish Control Layer. There are 3 configuration files in Varnish, 2 of which I've never even seen. I relied on Q and Dell for that. The Varnish Control Layer is the one that really determines how Varnish responds to HTTP requests and HTTPS requests. In order to get Varnish to work with Drupal, you have to make some specific VCL changes. Once you understand it, you go, oh, that's why I need to do that. But up front, I was just like, huh? So we were lucky. We didn't start from scratch. We worked with the default VCL file that comes from this excellent article from Nate Haug at Lullabot. I think he probably saved us, about 40 hours as a starting point. It was very helpful. If you're going to do Varnish with Drupal, start here, this article. And that default VCL file will save you lots of time. And he actually did something that is somewhat rare in the open source community, in my opinion. The documentation in his file was fantastic. We made some key modifications. So some pieces you have to mod are pretty straightforward. And these actual pound signs, these are the references in the actual default VCL file. So you can just search for this and find this. So list of backends, where your Drupal server's at, how you find them. Don't cache these paths. Define the directory if you're using clustering. The trickiest part, though, is this section. Remove all cookies that Drupal doesn't need to know about. I've included the code here. You can see it's quite a few regular expressions. I'm going to try to walk through the logic of what is happening here. It's one of these things that's kind of turned on its ear, but it works, and it's, I don't use this word often, but it's kind of brilliant. With incoming requests, what Varnish does is it strips out of the HTTP header a collection of Drupal-specific cookies that are the ones that are cookies for anonymous users. But it leaves intact the Drupal session cookies. It leaves them there. Then Varnish says, if there are no cookies left, serve a cache page or go get it, and then serve the cache page. If there are cookies left in the request header, Varnish then passes that request through to Drupal. The idea being, again, the session variables are kept, then Varnish knows, oh, this is an authenticated user, just pass them through. And that's what you want with your users who are logged in. You don't want them getting cache pages. I thought, there's no way this is going to work. There's no way this makes sense. And it does, and it's pretty slick. There's, oh, go ahead.
What defines the specific Drupal cookies legally stripped? You do.
You do. There's a set that comes with the Lullabot file. This strips out most of them. This is where we ran into trouble, and actually it was good that we ran into trouble, because if you're a Drupal developer, you want to understand how this section of the VCL file works, and you want to know what's going on. One, we found that Drupal 7 had a couple of cookies that weren't referenced, and so we had to add this line. We had to take out the has.js, and the Drupal toolbar collapsed. And the Drupal toolbar collapsed is only for logged in users, for authenticated users. But if you log out, that cookie is still there. And what happens with that cookie still being there, the way the VCL file is set up, is that Varnish goes, oh, there's a cookie, and passes you through and stops doing any caching behavior for that user. By stripping these out, we were able to restore the functionality it was supposed to have. More important, and this is why I thought it was sort of fortunate that we had to struggle with this, is that if you upgrade Drupal, you may add another cookie. You can roll in a JavaScript. You don't think it'll have anything. I've saw it with quick tabs. Suddenly you've got another cookie. All of a sudden Varnish stops working. It's continuing to do its thing, but it stops recognizing anonymous users as anonymous users per this logic. So understanding this and having this, the rest of it's, if you're experienced with Drupal, with Linux, and if you have great system administrators, it's pretty straightforward. That's a lot. Are there any questions about that?
A different perspective possibly is we took the control flow as how do we tell if somebody's authenticated and therefore needs fresh data? They've got to have the right kind of cookie. Well, we've got all these other cookies that we don't care about, strip them out. And because of that flow, then we had to sit down and figure out, well, rather, Josh had to sit down and figure out which cookies are the ones that we don't care about, and then make sure that we had a regular expression that we dropped on. In the VCL file itself, you can, it's its own kind of language that says, do this logic, and if it passes through, it goes through. So you could decide, you know what, I don't want to go the cookie route, I want to use some other aspect of the request as it comes in to determine whether or not it goes through or not, and make it as simple or as complex as you want it to be.
So is there any change in the user experience with having the cookies be stripped out?
No. So what happens is I'm a regular user. I go to this emergency website to find out that there's a crater where the event presence would be. I see that. However, somebody from public safety says you need to know that the crater was this wide and it's deep, and they want to be able to log in and update the information and have it update now, and then the anonymous user gets to see it within a couple of minutes. So anonymous user comes in and they get all those kind of standard cookies where they're trying to figure out what can your browser do, all of those sorts of things. Drupal has already, on the first request, set those cookies. They're not changing over the life of the session. So telling Drupal about them again doesn't matter. So the request comes in, what do you see? Just whatever Varnish had once the cache is gone. So the Drupal on Apache never even sees that request. The flip side is now we do want it to see the request. Okay, what's important? Well, this cookie was. Alright, you're not going to get one cache response. You're going to actually talk to Apache.
So when it passes through the request to the Apache server, does it put back the cookies it's stripped out, or do you just send only through those particular cookies that did not get stripped out?
I don't know.
I can answer that. And I thought about that last night, and I went, I don't know the answer to that question, so I went and looked it up. What I believe happens is that the stripping out of the cookies is simply something that Varnish does as part of its evaluation. You're nodding your head.
I mean, that makes sense. It's not like necessarily modifying it, it's just stripping those out and looking at the ones it needs for its logic.
Okay, so that's just part of its evaluation logic, not what it's actually doing to modify the request. Okay.
I believe that you can actually have it modify the request.
Yes, you can.
But
And you can, there are, I think 100 100 may be a mild exaggeration, but in the logging perspective it talks about later, there are every aspect of that incoming request is something that gets logged, it's something that's in the headers. You can manipulate those and do whatever you want. It really is full feature and has the potential for a fair bit of complexity if you want.
You could go
Do we
crazy.
have a comparison of this versus Squid? Because Squid has got a lot of that capability as well.
We didn't
look at it.
Okay.
Does it do anything with the caching of static content, it's images, stuff like that?
Yep. Very good question. It does. It caches. It's an HTTP cacher, so web pages, any files that are passed on, CSS, etc. When we were testing, we actually, we'll get to the pressure testing, we were actually sending 11 requests to simulate what a new request to the front page of the emergency site would be. And one of those was for the HTML, the others were for images, CSS files, JavaScript, etc. And it cached those just fine. It doesn't pass those through. So, which was I'm glad it worked that way.
So even though that it's a authenticated session, the person is logged in, when they're getting the logo from the website, it's...
If they're logged in, it bypasses the cache. That was our criteria.
Yeah.
If they're not logged in, then it hits the cache and everything gets cached.
I'm not sure if it's the same ECL that you guys were looking at. This one I've looked at recently was actually caching static assets. So assets for things type.
Yep.
It had extensions with that, but it was also for authenticating.
Was it?
Right. And the real benefit of that is that the Varnish caching happens in memory versus execution.
Right.
Our scenario was we wanted anybody that was logging in and modifying things to be able to see what had changed right away. And it's the site is a very simple site. It's not
What about by nature static extension?
they might have been.
What we did in writing this presentation was we took the approach of, here's what you need to do to get Varnish working with Drupal, here's where to look. Varnish was kind of like the professional equivalent of Skyrim for me. I realized that I could float down that rabbit hole and spend an untold number of hours going, this is cool, this is cool. So we haven't actually gotten to the detail, and in certain cases we're going to be like, I don't know. So,
As far as I can tell, you can do whatever you want as long as you know your site well enough to be able to know this type of request goes to cache, this one doesn't. Here's how you determine. And you have to know your website, all the URIs that are coming in really well.
all right, so move on to pressure testing. So I mentioned this earlier. For the emergency site, we needed to have an idea of how much traffic the site could handle before we had an actual campus crisis. A lot of sites, if you're starting to get to the point where maybe we need to do some front-end caching, you're going to be seeing some sort of incremental rise. We didn't have that. We were going to go from nothing to ungodly numbers in like 2 minutes. Like it hit CNN and we're like, oh no. So what we did was we identified some minimum target numbers, and then we went in search of a tool to pressure test. And the tool we ended up with, I believe, I have two sisters who are from China, and they would pronounce it correctly, and I think it's Song. But we call it T-Song because that's just easier, and we're in Iowa. It's an open source HTTP testing tool. It uses Erlang and allows you to cluster multiple servers together into a single engine. It's also fairly complex. It uses an XML structure. You can create multiple sessions. You can break things down by probability. You can set cookies. You can do SSL. It's rather intensive. We used it as a rather large hammer. We ended up in a 6-server cluster of T-Song. We were generating sizable traffic. We ended up running 90 plus pressure tests over 4 months, a good portion of which were done on weekend mornings. We did them on weekend mornings ostensibly because we were going to thrash the network pretty well and we didn't want to interrupt regular business. But I think another part was we were cackling maniacally and disturbing everybody else. Where else do you get the opportunity to get turned loose on the network and see if you can break it? We had a blast. So our tests focus specifically on the emergency information homepage. There are some additional pieces on that site, but they're pretty much, in a crisis, we're trying to have everything on the homepage. What we want to do is simulate a new user, and what we want to measure was a new user coming to that page for the first time, or somebody hitting Control-R and refreshing all the content. So all of our numbers, one session request actually was 11 file grabs. And that was what our focus was. We went with Varnish 2.15, Red Hat over VMware, 2 CPUs, 4 gig of RAM each. And we had 2 of those in our testing. And I believe we went with Varnish 2.1.5 because that was the latest version that Red Hat supported in some way. It was much easier on the maintenance side. My understanding is that there's cool stuff in Varnish 3, but again, it was that rabbit hole, so I stayed away. So our baseline test, we ran Drupal without Varnish. We had 2 Drupal servers clustered behind our local traffic manager. We started timing out at around 2,000 HTTP requests per second. We were starting to get some 500s in there. Might have been a little bit lower. We never quite measured it. We went, okay, yeah, that's not our target. When we put Varnish in,
Was that anonymous traffic? Was
yes.
it like Drupal's built-in caching, or did you have caching turned on?
we had caching turned on, and we had a 3-minute caching period. And we were running our tests for between 2 and 10 minutes. And I think the one...
We're doing 5 minutes mostly.
Was that 5 minutes when we were testing that? So, because you set it running, and then you go, and then you know it didn't work because it's... anyway, sorry.
Okay.
Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Just one more. Were you using any alternate caching backend? Memcache or anything?
We do have Memcache installed.
Is that what this was run against?
Yes.
Or was it against the database cache?
We were running Memcache.
Okay.
But with Memcache, you want to go in and make certain that certain bins are still in the database. So some of them, a lot of them were Memcache, but not all.
Okay.
I believe that the page cache was in Memcache. I believe that bin was. It should be. The page and file cache. Any other questions about this? With Varnish in place, we were actually never able to get Varnish to error out. We went with a 3-server TSUN cluster. That wasn't enough. We went to a 6-server TSUN cluster, and that wasn't enough. With 2 Varnish servers, we were able to get 7,400 HTTP transactions, give or take, sustained over 10 minutes. My understanding is Varnish didn't break a sweat. With a single Varnish server, we said, okay, we can't do this. We took one out. We were able to get to about 6,300 HTTP requests or transactions per second over 2 minutes. At that point, I think that Varnish started going above the minimum thread count that we'd set.
Yeah.
So it started to sweat a little bit about that at that point.
But it wasn't really sweating. It was just then we found a best practices tuning guide that said basically 200 threads per CPU. So set your min thread, in our case, to 400. We never had gotten above 400 threads. So on this final run, I think we got up to maybe 700. And the max was set at 4,000. And the load on the box was maybe 1.5. And it really wasn't working all that hard. But it was fun. The thread count.
We don't know where the limitation came from. And maybe if we added another 3 servers in the cluster, we might have been able to generate more traffic. It could be that at any of the router points or firewall, we don't know. What we had gleaned by this, though, was that our plan to host exclusively on campus was probably not the right way to go. We had already kind of known that we were going to transition in that direction for a variety of reasons. So we stopped our testing here. We moved what we had into production. And our next phase is going to be extending some part of this cluster into the cloud. We don't know exactly where yet. That's our next phase. But those are pretty big numbers, and it was, I won't say it was disappointing that we couldn't get Varnish.
Unsatisfying.
Unsatisfying that we couldn't get Varnish to tip over.
So how big is the network pipe that those servers had in them?
They had 2 gig, and we were getting at least 2 gig. The local traffic managers had 2 gig interfaces.
At this point, we weren't using the local traffic.
No, we were using
at that
GTM.
point.
At this point, we're DNS round robin.
So those are what, 10?
Yeah, it's data center bandwidth There's, could be router, could be switch, could be, there are still firewall components.
Somewhere between 1 and 10. The LTMs had 2 gigs in the early testing. We were doing, we did that?
We hit the 2 gig limit.
Yeah, we were pushing them fully, and then we said, well, that's a limitation, let's get rid of those. And
Not open stuff up. I think the only
some, but we still couldn't get it to follow.
I think the only thing we wanted to accomplish with this that we really didn't do was getting somebody from our security and policy office to call us in a frantic state because the firewall crashed. That we weren't able to make that happen. So we did try. So the other thing to note about Varnish logs is they're extensive. They collect around 100 data points per request. One of the recommendations is that you mod your config file to write your Varnish logs to NAS. Is that correct?
No, a tempfs.
Tempfs. Okay.
So you can the Varnish logs to a log file. You can put that in memory, and it keeps kind of a cache of the logs. But per request, all of the did you go out? You know, was it in cache? Was it not? How responsive? There's everything, and there's a Varnish log command that you can use to watch the logs to spit out stuff. You can stick it into a database so that you can query it later. You can add regular expressions to say, I only want these pieces of information if they match here. Another one of these rabbit holes just by itself.
Let me get this correct. You're collecting 100 data points per request for each of those 7,000 requests per minute.
Second.
Per second. Excuse me.
Yeah.
Okay.
So the downside is once it happens, it's gone.
Sure.
It's not like you're filling up our log sort of thing. It's you either have something that's watching it come in because it dumps it to this log file that you stick in memory, and you can watch it go by, or you can find some other means to copy it off somewhere else. Initially, there's a Varnish NCSA logger that spits out Apache-style logs. They weren't terribly satisfying, other than you tail the Varnish log on one system and watch it just screaming past you, and then you tail the Apache log on the Drupal, and every couple of minutes the line will go by. So it was useful to say, yes, Varnish is doing something. But it was one of those rabbit holes again. What do we care about? And if we'd been able to make it fall over, then I think we would have gotten more interested in trying to pick apart what was happening.
One other thing to note about our testing protocol, I kept forgetting this, which is the funny part, and they would remind me, is when we're running these high pressure tests and hitting it, I would go in and I would log it and make modifications to the site to make certain that the pass-through was working and to make certain that everything was clearing. And it worked like a charm. I would actually say Drupal was faster. Anything else to add on?
So once you edited the page, did the Varnish recognize the fact that the page had been changed and drop the cache copy and pick up the edited copy?
So you configure how long you keep it in cache, and I think our requirements were 3 minutes. That the page refresh within 2 minutes of an update. And so we had an arbitrary anything in the cache that's older than 3 minutes, get a new
However, if you install the Drupal module, the Drupal Varnish module, and establish connections there, you have to work some port stuff and probably some firewall rules. But once you get that in place, then Drupal can tell Varnish, hey, I just changed this page, clear the cache. That's a little bit more, I did it in test, but I never moved it in production because our specs didn't require it. But there's some really interesting things once you have that hook between Drupal and Varnish to feed that information. There's some really interesting caching things you can do where you can almost instantaneously purge and start refreshing right away. Depending on what you need in the circumstances, that can be really useful.
Just thinking in terms of, okay, if you've got departmental secretaries who are updating pages on the site, and they click save, and they go back to look at what they just saved, whether...
If they're logged in, it bypasses. In our scenario, it bypasses.
Right, but then when they log out and their changes disappear, they might get a little bit upset.
Welcome
And
to
then we tell them, yes, it's caching. We're expecting a lot of load. You have to wait 3 minutes. Or we get tired of answering that question. We implement that Varnish module, and it goes away. But yes, that is certainly a user education issue.
I have other sites that I maintain that if they received enough traffic, that we would put Varnish in front of them, we would have to implement that sort of direct clearing. This simply wasn't a use case that we needed. Sure. We've listed some resources here. Again, the Lullaby article. Firefox Web Developer Toolbar. You can view response headers under the information. That was the key to being able to tune our VCL file. Highly recommended. If you're not using it, it's really cool. There's some articles, best practices, tuning, and Varnish stat. Anything you want to add on the resources? Sorry. There we go.
So the best practices was how do you set up the parameters for how many threads you're going to do, where are you going to stick the memory cache, how big. In our case, the memory cache was a gig, and our site fit in that completely, and then some.
Yeah. Both things like
When you
400K.
say where you're going to stick, what do you mean by where you're going to stick it?
You have the option to stick it in a file on disk.
Oh,
So it's Varnish is going to cache. Where are you going to cache? You can say file, you can put it in memory. You can,
Gotcha. Okay.
I think
I thought you meant where are you going to stick the memory?
no. It's file, malloc, there might have been one or two others. We suck it all in memory. And then talking about tuning, putting this Varnish log that it corrects all its data to, put that on a tempfs, doing things like making sure that the number of open files for the Varnish user was significantly high so that it could do its things. Those types of things were all in the Varnish best practice and tuning guide. Varnish stat was kind of like top for Varnish. It was what are you doing right now, and a number of those kind of cricket attributes that were all about the side. This post would say, how do you make sense out of what you're staring at? What are the things that you care about? And it's, it looks like somebody opened it up and came up with a MS Paint and drew the little red circle and said, this is this. And so, Varnish that for dummies. It looked like that, but it was very useful for, okay, this is what I actually need to look at, care about, and useful in that regard. What were the landmines? We couldn't find it. I mean, VCL file, making sure that was right. The early ones were the Drupal config. The way we had set it up had a few 404 errors, and so Apache.
That's my fault.
But it was interesting because Apache was at max clients like 256, and it was just falling over pretty quickly.
404s.
And the 404 errors in a Drupal that are your own fault, not the ones that are just random grabbers from the internet, are very expensive. Like significantly expensive in terms of the thread that fires up, how long it keeps the thread open before it can for those things. So if you're worried about things, look at your logs for 404 errors that are your fault and fix them. That allowed us to get.
It's a 404 error that's your fault more expensive than a 404 error that's somebody looking for a page that doesn't exist anymore.
Well, it's if you've got 3 or 4 images that you're referring to that aren't found on each page, and you look at that page,
sure, right.
then every page load means 3 or 4 errors. Fixing those, we were able to get quite a bit higher. This was pre-Varnish, and then this was our first day of testing. And then we went, oh, yeah, this is it. We're not getting anywhere close to the numbers we need. And that's when we went to Varnish. Any other stumbling blocks?
It's hard for me to think of it because I was really impressed with how well it installed and how quickly we were able to get. When we started, I was like Varnish. I was thinking it was going to be a PhD course. It was intense, but I found that because it's mature and its relationship with Drupal is mature, you Google foo your way through quite a bit of it.
Yeah, I think the biggest one is you have to know your site. You have to know what kind of requests are coming in. You have to know how, it's not just enough, my page is there, it loads. You really have to know about all the URIs that are coming in. And how does that work if you want to move on. The other problem was kind of getting, it's that standard problem of here's documentation, here are how-tos. Oh, they refer to an earlier version of Varnish, so this doesn't apply, or these apply to a later version of Varnish, so this doesn't apply. But those are standard with any kind of tool you download, making sure that the documentation matches up.
How much RAM did you allocate on the Varnish machines?
4 gigs each, right?
Yeah.
How much?
4 gigabytes each.
4 gigs. Multiple cores?
We only have one allocated memcache. Servers have 4, but I think memcache only have.
Cache was on Drupal, right?
Okay.
The memory cache for
The
Varnish.
memory cache for Varnish is only 1.
It's only 1 gig.
Right.
We're dealing with a very small site though, so depending on how many pages you have that you're going to be caching, pages and files, it could be different. We're really only caching maybe 25 files total for the entire site. So we could probably bop down from that.
Yeah. The Varnish log was 80 megabytes, so made 100 megabyte FFS file system for that a little bit too. Yeah. That's a function. So I think how big your site is, you can fit your whole site into memory. Yay. And you can afford the memory. Nice.
Good
If
question.
not, then
Question in the back.
So something else that we introduced someone, Chris, and we've been something with Create for about 2 years now. One of the things that is useful is a reverse proxy, because you can use the UCL file to set different requirements. If it's this path, I want you to go to the servers, this path go to another server. Where would something like that be useful? If you want to put a namespace off to the primary server. So in the greatest case, we're moving off a typo-free instance where everything is under one subdomain, moving to a multi-site where we're splitting our sites into subdomains. Well, we can't do it all at once. So what happens when we want to have our homepage be our Drupal site? We have all this other stuff which is under subdirectory pathing. What do? We have to do like www2 kind of thing. Well, what we use Varnish for is we redirected all the Drupal paths. So if those are going to go to our Drupal server, and so that's like /user, all of those, and like the particular paths that we said that we wanted to use on Drupal. And so if it doesn't match any of those, then it kicks it over to the typo-free server. And so that way we didn't have to put out a new subdomain to eventually bring that back. Because eventually you seem like you wind up with like www3 after a while. And so we were able to avoid that whole mess by using Varnish.
You had somebody who already understood Varnish when you decided to do that, didn't you?
no, I mean that's not terrible.
Yes and no. It was, we knew that we wanted the caching, and that was an added perk because we knew that was a problem we were searching for how we're going to solve it. And so Varnish can do this. Then it's like a sigh of relief because that whole problem is went away.
Oh, excellent.
You should do the same thing with proxy paths in the Apache server.
Yeah, but proxy pass doesn't cache for
Sure.
So if you want the cache,
It's a definitely added benefit if you're already using Varnish. You can do more things than what we talked about here today.
That's excellent to know. I wouldn't have even thought of that, although now that you mentioned, I think I read an article that said you could do that. So,
any of those headers. You can do regex and not.
Question?
Did you ever see how much page load performance increase happened with Varnish versus before Varnish?
Page load increase where?
Like-
At the client or?
Yeah.
The client, when we were pounding on it, was a T-sign server or this T-sign process. So
I just mean like a regular user. You're not under the stress.
I don't think you would have seen any difference at all because Varnish isn't actually changing very much, maybe a few tweaks in the header, but the file itself, which the browser's going to have to unpack, is pretty much the same. So I don't think, from what I've read, from what we've seen, I don't see any behaviors that would increase anything at the client end.
I thought I'd seen something that said it would speed up the client end
several times.
And it depends on under what kind of load. I mean, and that was ultimately what you're saying is when I was the only person hitting the site, it would load quicker. When we were pummeling it, you know, with gigabytes of traffic, it would still load like whereas when we were doing it without Varnish, we'd start to load and it would just kind of, and then it would, you know, give a 500 error because we were max clients or
I'll take 30 seconds to load the page.
Actually, I can see a case where the performance decline would increase from Varnish if it's hitting a page where all the files had already been cached at Varnish. So Drupal doesn't have to do the image styles, any of that application, it's packing it. So delivering from cache might be a faster load time. It's not really improving performance at the client end so much as improving the network traffic and the latency.
Yeah, so the user might perceive it as a speedier server, but it's actually not really speeding up the server anymore. It's just simply getting the data back to the user with less delay. Yes.
Are you sure you don't work in marketing? Because perception is the word they use all the time. Sorry.
You knows I'm the
Josh,
server.
this is Dave.
Hi, Dave.
This is Josh.
Nice to meet you. Are there other questions?
Do you know if Varnish helps increase like JavaScript speeds? For example, right now we're using Drupal as a class like registration and calendar page. So my front page loads in Java with JavaScript. It just seems like it takes forever compared to anything else.
So what this does is it gets the file to your browser quickly.
Okay.
So if your JavaScript is 10,000 lines long and it's random and weird, then when Firefox or Safari or Chrome has to take that JavaScript and figure out what to do with it, the fact that it got that file under load in, you know, milliseconds instead of seconds doesn't change. Once it's there, now the browser has to process it and figure out what to do with it. And that was one of the comments in this. One of the comments in the tuning guide was threads are not this magical thing that if you just increase them infinitely, your sites can go better. 5,000 really is kind of the max thread count. If you feel yourself needing to go beyond 5,000 threads, you have a problem with your website. Fix your website.
So I can be the only user and it takes like 5 seconds, you know. It's not too long, but it's long enough that you're like, right.
Ready. Yeah. So Varnish would be saving you from the slowdown when everybody on campus decides to load that page simultaneously.
Okay.
I can think of about 6 different points off the top of my head in Drupal where you could be having it slow down that prior to the JavaScript being processed in Drupal. So,
Yeah, I was going to expand on like it could be an aggregation issue, you make requests with JavaScript, or your JavaScript will be actually making requests back to the server. In that case, Varnish will help.
Yeah.
we're at 2:45 right now. Our contact information is here. I think I'll volunteer. I'd be happy to take any questions.
I'll be happy to forward any of your questions to Josh.
Well, I can't answer them. I'll forward them back. Thank you all very much.
Is the slideshow anywhere online?
No, but if you want, there's the whole recordings in the Camtasia.
Oh, okay.
But if you want, send me an email and I'll just send you the slide deck.
There's also a form where you can upload it from your presentation.
Really?
Yeah.
There yesterday.
When you edit the presentation, you can put the little summary in. You scroll down like 3 scrolls worth, there's an upload. Tells you how big.
It's pretty small.
If I remember, it'll be there as well. So. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.